Reparations Conversation Media Analysis, and in this edition, we will be analyzing the statements of the woman of the moment, our dear sister Olukemi Olufunto Adegoke Badenoch. Yeah, the now leader of the Conservative and Unionist Party. Yes, indeed, brothers and sisters. Glass ceilings are broke all over the place. You don't know, yeah? But this is a little bit before our dear sister Kemi became the leader of the Conservative Party. When she was running for the election, she took part in a town hall type discussion stroke debate with GB News. And for those who are not familiar with the UK media landscape, GB News is essentially trying to be the Fox News, of the UK. Between GB News and Talk TV, they're trying to be the Fox News, of the UK. Started a few years ago by some big business people who felt, and journalists, who felt that the television news landscape in the UK leaned too far to the left, including the BBC. And so it's generally speaking accepted that as far as print media goes, print media in the UK, the newspaper, them, generally speaking, lean to the right. Yeah. And so these people felt that there wasn't enough right-leaning, media as far as TV is concerned. So they created GB News. And that is important for our analysis today, because you want to understand that when Kemi Badenoch is featuring on GB News, she is essentially talking to her base, the Conservative Party base, the Conservative Party supporters, and Conservative Party supporters who have now defected to the Reform Party because they don't think that the Conservative Party is doing enough. And so therefore, the Conservative Party is engaged in trying to win them back to the Conservative Party. That is the context for Kemi Badenoch's appearance on GB News, and why GB News is even hosting a debate for a Conservative Party leadership election in the first place. So that's the context. But we're getting out of the video. We're going to play the whole video and then come to some analysis afterwards.
Question here about our imperial past, colonial past as a country. The Commonwealth Heads of Government meeting starts next week. Should we be embarrassed about our colonial past?
No. We don't need to be embarrassed about our colonial past. Every country in the world, at one point or another, either colonized or attempted to colonize another group of people. This is the past. We need to talk about the future. There are many countries now who want to use guilt to try and exploit the UK. They ask for reparations. I saw it as a trade minister. It's not culture wars. I was at the WTO. I won't name the minister from another country. And he was telling me that we needed to give up some of the things that we were doing because of colonialism and because they needed time to develop. These arguments are a scam. Don't fall for it. We need to make sure that we put this country first. We work well with our neighbors. We work well with other countries, but we have to look after ourselves too.
Well, I mean, those advocating for reparations would say, shouldn't we just make up for some of the damage we did through the slavery? As a black woman saying that, they may find that hard to understand from you.
Well, there are many things that the British Empire got wrong, but there are many amazing things that the British Empire also did. And we need to be honest about that and stop pretending that it was all bad. The British Empire ended slavery, the Atlantic slave trade. We need to talk about that more. I grew up, as many of you know, I grew up in a Commonwealth country. Many people in those countries don't actually carry the baggage that a lot of the left-leaning commentariat want to put on our country. We need to look at how we can help other countries develop as best as they can. We did a lot to help many of those countries. We can do more again. I would like to see that. But the answer is definitely not reparations.
OK, there we are.
All right, so let's break this down. First and foremost, it was a very interesting question that the man did ask her, He didn't ask her, think about it. He did not actually ask her about reparations. Is she insert reparations in the conversation? He asked her about whether Britain should be embarrassed about its imperial history. Now, it's worth noting that a question like that especially asking somebody who's running for leadership of a political party, has nothing to do with any policies of the Conservative Party or any policies through which they're going to challenge, yes, the government, which is what the opposition party is supposed to do in the UK Parliament. This has nothing to do with any of those things. This question is purely designed for Kemi Badenoch to demonstrate to her supposed and proposed base in the Conservative Party, which is predominantly white Britons of the right wing, that she is completely invested and loyal to the United Kingdom of Great Britain and their interest as white Britons. She has to demonstrate and appease them to the extent that they understand she will not be bringing in any of the politics that you might expect from somebody who is a descendant of those who were enslaved and colonized by the United Kingdom of Great Britain. That is the only purpose for such a question. And so she has to now hit the major talking points. The first and foremost, that Britain abolished the so-called slave trade. And, these people have quite an audacity, yeah? We won't go into this today. If you want to get into that particular topic even more, check out our video entitled British Abolition, Lies and Deceit. And Brother Leader Bandaka breaks it down expertly. But the people have an audacity, yeah, to, be celebrating and try to impose this philosophy of them abolishing the so-called slave trade when during the time when they say they were abolishing the slave trade, they were in fact ramping up their invasion and conquest and colonization of the African continent while they were continuing to colonize Africans throughout the Americas. This is the same period when they were committing mass murder, mass rape, and mass pillaging the length and breadth of the African continent, whilst they are claiming and insisting that everybody believe and thank them for supposedly abolishing the slave trade. Like I said, check out the video if you want more information on that. Then now, it's important to also address the fact that there are some people who, in relation to these comments, have tried to suggest that her rejection of reparations, it has something to do with the fact that she is from West Africa. This is now regurgitating and repurposing the idea that Africans sold us from the Caribbean into slavery. And so basically, because that their ancestors on the west coast of Africa were all slave traders, they are not going to be aligned with the issue of reparations and reparatory justice. Well, we have to look at the fact directly that Kemi Badenoch herself did not evoke an allegiance to any supposed slave trading West African ancestry when she was justifying her rejection of reparations as a just demand. She evoked and she spoke directly to an allegiance to Britain, Britishness, and British interests. So we should be able to dash that one there right to the side. And furthermore, as we demonstrate in our video, Nigerians react to Kemi Badenoch's leadership appointment, even Africans in the nation of Nigeria, where Kemi Badenoch comes from, are critical of Kemi Badenoch for her stance on reparations and how it affects Africans across the African continent and Africans throughout the diaspora. So that entire argument is a complete nonsense. But the aspect of her response that most interests me, which we want going to today, is when she brought up the World Trade Organization, the WTO. As Kemi said, she used to be the trade minister on behalf of the UK, the top diplomat dealing with international trade on behalf of the United Kingdom of Great Britain. And she went to places and there were people from developing countries, ministers from developing countries that she didn't name, who were imploring her as the British representative to change many of the policies that govern the activity of the World Trade Organization. Why? Because these countries need to develop and they need time to be able to do so. And her rejection of said demand or request, polite request, however it was put towards her, in her estimation, is a defense of British interests. Well, what is the World Trade Organization? By the way, this is an interesting addition to these conversations before we get to explaining what the World Trade Organization is. Because as I've been detailing, almost all of the conversations on reparations in British media focus almost exclusively on the issue of monetary recompense, compensation. Yeah. But when Kemi Badenoch opens the issue of the World Trade Organization, she's speaking to another one of the 5 components of reparations, as we've been detailing. Within the context of international law, reparations includes restitution, rehabilitation, compensation, satisfaction, and guarantees of non-repetition. So, when we speak of guarantees of non-repetition and satisfaction, there are a few things within those 2 paradigms that relate to the World Trade Organization. For example, within the context of satisfaction is the concept of cessation. That means you have to stop do what you do. If there are things that you are doing that are continuing to cause or exacerbate the harm, these things must be stopped. Cessation, yeah? And then guarantees of non-repetition speaks to the addressing and changing of laws, policies, structures, and institutions that contribute to the exacerbation or the furtherance, the continuance of harm. Okay, and so when the World Trade Organization and powerful nations within the World Trade Organization are asked to address their policies, we are now in the realm of dealing with satisfaction and guarantees of non-repetition. So what is the World Trade Organization? The World Trade Organization was established in between 1995 and 1998. It was designed to replace what preceded it, which was the Global Agreement on Trade and Tariffs. Today, the World Trade Organization functions as one of the big 3 in global economics, the other 2 being the International Monetary Fund and the World Bank. And the role of the World Trade Organization within that context is to design and implement the rules of international trade, to design and implement the rules of international trade. So the rules that govern how different nations trade with each other. Yeah. Now, the idea put forward by the World Trade Organization is that they are in place to ensure that international trade takes place on a quote unquote level playing field. But from the perspective of formerly colonized and currently near colonized nation, the World Trade Organization, the charge that has been levied against the World Trade Organization is that really and truly it is a body designed to ensure that the markets of the quote unquote developing world are always open to the corporations, the companies, and other institutions of the developed world or the Western world. That is the charge that is levied at the World Trade Organization, which is why this particular minister, whoever they were, was demanding some changes to the order. Yeah. Now, the question then becomes, how does the World Trade Organization engage global economics and trade in ways that privilege Western nations to the detriment of other nations in the world? And particularly here, we are concerned, because it named Kimbunga media, with Africa and the Caribbean. Let's look at this. So one of the policies, yeah, that people challenge the World Trade Organization for implementing and or sanctioning is how subsidies operate on the global stage in relation to global trade. A subsidy, for those who are not aware, is when a government within a nation foots the bill for the cost of the production of a commodity. Yeah. And the most famous one in this regard is agricultural subsidies. Western nations tend to heavily subsidize the agricultural sector. In other words, they pay the farmers the cost of production, and this allows the farmers to charge and offer lower prices on the global stage in the market because they don't have to factor the cost of production into those prices. All right. The World Trade Organization makes an exception specifically, in particular, or in a way that allows Western nations to take better advantage of on the global stage. Why? Because when we're dealing with the IMF and the World Bank, the IMF and the World Bank are often in position to impose policies on nations that are less powerful within their auspices, within global trade, economics, and politics that discourage and or coerce and or impose policies upon the nation whereby they are not allowed, the government is not allowed to subsidize its farmers. So what is the result of this? The result of this is that whereas these Western nations are able to charge lower prices, it makes them more competitive in the global market, whereas farmers in Africa and the Caribbean have to foot the bill for production and therefore factor that cost into what they provide or offer on the market. Therefore, they are less competitive in the global market. It often results in nations whereby agricultural produce is produced, it being cheaper for the majority of people living in those nations to buy the foreign imported goods. So this, as a well-known example, produces situations like Ghana and many other places in West Africa, which are vast rice-producing nations and have been producing rice for centuries, having to import rice from America and Thailand. Why? Because it's easier and cheaper for the masses of people in those nations to buy the Thailand rice and the American rice than the homegrown Ghana rice. That's one implication of that policy. The other implication of the policy is that it makes it more difficult for our nations to sell our produce on the global stage because our prices are, generally speaking, higher. That's one way in which the World Trade Organization detrimentally impacts the development of developing nations. Yeah. Another one is this concept of trade tariff escalation or tariff escalation. Yeah. Now, simply put, a tariff is a tax on companies and corporations selling their wares, foreign companies selling their wares in your nation. If you want to sell your cars in this nation, for example, they put a tax on it, so you have to pay the government a certain amount of money. And so what Western nations or developed, quote unquote, developed nations tend to do is they have low tariffs, yeah, on raw materials and agricultural produce, but a higher tariffs on semi and completely finished products. And so the more value you add to the product or the commodity, the higher the tariff will be. Simple example, oil, you dig oil, you can sell that, low tariff. Dig oil, refine oil, higher tariff. Cobalt, mine cobalt, sell that, lower tariff. Mine cobalt, contribute to the creation of electronic devices, higher tariffs. Yeah. Now, what this does is that it protects the homegrown industries within the developed nations. And again, the IMF and World Bank collaborate and conspire to ensure that said protection doesn't exist in quote unquote developing nations, particularly in Africa and the Caribbean. And so it creates a cycle whereby our nations are encouraged to maintain the export of raw materials and agricultural produce as our only viable economic activity. Why? Because it costs more for us to produce finished products and be able to sell them on the market. Because in order to make it worth your while, you need to be able to export what you are producing. But many of our nations don't have the readies, and the corporations within our nations don't have the readies to be able to pay the exorbitant tariffs in those nations. So the only thing that we can do is sell raw materials, and this contributes to the perpetuation of the underdevelopment and the I was about to say deindustrialization, but it's not even that. It's unindustrialization and under-industrialization of our nations. These are some of the policies of the World Trade Organization now, yeah, that Kemi Badenoch said that the minister was referring to. Another issue is the issue of trade-related intellectual property rights. Trade-related intellectual property rights relate to and essentially govern the rules around patents, on the global stage. And how this operates, particularly for given one more popular example, is the issue of medicine. There are a lot of patents on medicine, which means that you are not allowed to reproduce those medicines without permission from the people that hold the patents. And in order to get said permission, you have to pay for the privilege, which means that in nations whereby they could produce the medicines themselves at a cheaper price, because of the policies imposed by the World Trade Organization in the idea of supposedly protecting people's intellectual property, these nations are disallowed from doing so. So the only other option, therefore, is to buy the medicine from the foreign corporations. And obviously, because the medical sector and the health sector in many of our nations is severely under-resourced and therefore underdeveloped, it's not always possible for a nation to purchase all of the medicine that it needs. And so this has become a significant issue in the last few years because of the whole COVID and the issue of patenting of vaccines and so on and so forth. All right. So that's just one other way in which the issue of trade-related intellectual property rights negatively impacts the development of the economic development of our nations and privileges, Western nations in the process. And then we have the issue of the limited bargaining power that we often have when we sit at these tables at the World Trade Organization, and the disproportionate influence that nations like Britain and France and America wield at the bargaining table. And to extemporize on this a bit more, I'm going to read an excerpt from this book, Bad Samaritans: The Guilty Secrets of Rich Nations and the Threat to Global Prosperity, by an economist called Ha-Joon Chang. He's from South Korea, and he's actually a lecturer at Cambridge University in the UK. And he relays in this book an experience of one of his former students who happens to be from the African continent. He doesn't say which nation the student is from, but he does relay the experience. And so here goes. Moreover, there exists a vast gap in intellectual and negotiation resources between the two groups of countries. That's the developed and the developing countries. A former student of mine who has just left the diplomatic service of his native country in Africa once told me that his country had only 3 people, including himself, to attend all the meetings at the World Trade Organization in Geneva. The meetings often numbered more than a dozen a day, so he and his colleagues dropped a few meetings altogether and divided up the rest between the 3 of them. This meant that they could allocate only 2 or 3 hours to each meeting. Sometimes they went in at the right moment and made some useful contributions. Some other times they were not so lucky and got completely lost. In contrast, The United States, to take the example at the other extreme, had dozens of people working on intellectual property rights alone. But my former student said his country was lucky. More than 20 developing countries do not have a single person based in Geneva, and many have to get by with only 1 or 2 people. Many more stories like this can be told, but they all suggest that international trade negotiations are a highly lopsided affair. It is like a war where some people fight with pistols while the others engage in aerial bombardment. Now, there are other stories that we can tell here in terms of reports of literally countries being disallowed from entering certain meetings, because a lot of the meetings at the World Trade Organization are not conducted publicly in the open for all nations to take part in. They're conducted in what they call green rooms. And some nations are not allowed into the green room where certain policies are being discussed. But these are the kinds of institutional barriers that many nations in this day and age are challenging in relation to the World Trade Organization and the inequality that exists and the disparities that exist within global and international trade. How does this relate to the issue of reparations? Because the standing of nations like Britain and America and France, etc., in these institutions is, and our standing relative to them in Africa and the Caribbean, is a direct result of the fact that when these institutions were created, we were colonized by the developed nations in question, the Western nations in question. And so the policies that were designed and implemented and imposed and sanctioned through institutions like the World Trade Organization were designed to benefit Europe. We have to be clear about the fact that the World Trade Organization, the International Monetary Fund, and the World Bank were created after Mass European Tribal War II, aka World War II, for the purpose of rebuilding Europe and the Western world after they mash up themselves in their tribal war. These institutions were then repurposed. Once they had felt they had regained some ground, they were repurposed and directed against the interest of nations in Africa and the Caribbean and other places on the planet that were trying to now free themselves and throw off the yoke of colonialism, brothers and sisters. And so when Kemi Badenoch raises the issue of the World Trade Organization in this debate, whereby she is becoming the leader of the, as they put it, most successful political party in the entirety of Europe, what that means essentially is that she is asserting and assuring and ensuring that the United Kingdom of Great Britain is in a position to maintain and perpetuate its neo-colonial imperialist policies with impunity. She is letting the white British public know that under no circumstances am I going to challenge the neo-colonial order. She is making it clear that not only does Britain not want to, quote unquote, pay reparations, but Britain is a nation and must remain a nation dedicated to the continual and perpetual maintenance of Western imperialism, the subjugation of African people, and the underdevelopment and destruction of the institutions, economic and political, of African nations around the world. That is what Kemi Badenoch has just said in her answer. And it's important for us to be clear about what her answer means. The only question therefore becomes, what are we going to do in organizing in our own interest as African people?